What if the most dangerous secrets in Hollywood aren't about money, but about silence? What if the red carpets, viral interviews, and picture-perfect timelines are hiding something the industry is terrified to confront? Right now, social media is on fire after explosive online conversations linked to Teyana Taylor sparked a wave of speculation, fear, and unanswered questions. No official accusations, no confirmed diagnoses. Just something far more unsettling: patterns, implications, and a silence that feels louder than denial. According to claims,
Yeah, that's she's delivering a whole spirit amongst young girls. She's introducing. We've had a gangster spirit. The gangster spirit damn near wiped the young black males out. This whole spirit is fit to do a number on the young black girl.
circulating online, an insider with deep access to elite spaces hinted at a culture where image protection allegedly mattered more than accountability. Private gatherings, NDAs, power dynamics, and an unspoken rule that some stories are never supposed to surface. The internet reacted instantly. Old clips resurfaced, blind items reappeared, lyrics were reanalyzed, and suddenly, people weren't asking who said it. They were asking why no one is responding. Because when rumors are false, they're usually shut down fast. But this time, the response wasn't outrage. It was distance. No statements, no lawsuits, no clarity. And that's what has everyone uneasy. This isn't gossip. This feels like a warning. What happened next didn't feel accidental. It felt triggered. In the days following the online chatter linked to Teyana Taylor, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but noticeably. Conversations didn't explode with facts.
HPV. I bet she done had chlamydia, gonorrhea, trigonometry, crabs, and whatever else that can contract. Hell, you talking about she too motherfucking nasty, mannish, filthy at the mouth, and she ain't got them high dollar weed. Everybody done.
They stalled. And in Hollywood, silence is rarely empty. It's usually strategic. The initial reaction wasn't denial. There were no urgent press releases, no public legal threats, no carefully staged interviews to shut the story down. Instead, there was distance. Accounts went quiet. Comments were disabled. Appearances were postponed. The kind of response that doesn't confront a narrative, but waits for it to burn out. And that's when people started paying closer attention. Because when something truly has no weight, it's dismissed quickly. But when a story touches a nerve, the industry doesn't argue. It contains. Online, viewers began replaying old moments involving Teyana Taylor, not to accuse, but to reassess. Interviews that once felt casual now sounded guarded. Lyrics that were once celebrated suddenly felt layered. Public friendships were re-examined, not because new facts emerged, but because context changed. And context is powerful. What stood out wasn't any single clip or quote. It was repetition. Patterns. Similar stories told by different voices over time, none definitive on their own, but unsettling when stacked together. The internet didn't need proof. It recognized familiarity. At the center of it all was the idea, never officially stated, never legally confirmed, that certain environments within the entertainment world operate under different rules. Spaces where access is controlled, behavior is protected, and accountability is optional as long as influence remains intact. According to online commentary, the insider who sparked this wave didn't speak like someone chasing attention. Her tone wasn't celebratory, it wasn't triumphant, it sounded heavy, like someone who understood the cost of speaking, but felt boxed into a corner. She didn't list names, she didn't present evidence. Instead, she described a culture, one where private gatherings blur boundaries, where trust is assumed because of fame, where consequences are softened by power, and where silence is enforced not with threats, but with opportunity. That distinction matters. Because the most effective pressure in Hollywood isn't violence or intimidation, it's exclusion. Invitations stop coming. Calls go unanswered. Projects stall quietly. You're not attacked, you're erased. As discussions grew louder online, another shift occurred. Entertainment commentary accounts began changing their tone. Early concern turned into speculation about stress, about emotional overwhelm, about misinterpretation. The focus subtly moved away from what was implied and toward whether it should have been said at all. That redirection wasn't random. Crisis management rarely starts with denial. It starts with confusion. If people argue about motives, they stop focusing on substance. If the audience debates credibility, they stop asking questions. And slowly, the story loses its center. But something about this situation resisted that fade. Because no one involved rushed to clear the air. No clear denials came from the circles being speculated about. No decisive statements labeling the claims as false. Just vague language about misinformation, narratives taken out of context, and the dangers of online rumor culture. Carefully chosen words that addressed the atmosphere, without touching the implication. That restraint made people uneasy. Viewers noticed that while public silence remained, behavior changed behind the scenes. Associations appeared more cautious. Public appearances felt more curated. Certain names stopped appearing together. Nothing obvious enough to headline, but enough to feel intentional. And then there was the emotional shift from the woman who sparked it all. When she briefly reappeared online, her tone was different. Less fiery, more measured, almost guarded. Gone was the raw emotion. In its place was precision. Short statements, controlled language, no elaboration, no escalation. To some, it looked like retreat. To others, it looked like positioning. Because in industries built on leverage, timing matters more than volume. Loud accusations burn fast. Quiet implications linger. Online reactions fractured. Some praised her courage. Others questioned her timing. Others insisted the entire conversation was reckless. But even critics struggled to explain one thing: why the response from powerful circles felt so muted. If the story was baseless, why not crush it? If it was dangerous misinformation, why not confront it directly? Instead, the industry seemed to absorb it, and absorption is a form of acknowledgement. Meanwhile, blind items resurfaced, older ones, written years ago, long dismissed as exaggerations. On their own, they meant nothing, but read together, they painted a picture of normalized excess, protected behavior, and an unspoken understanding that certain lines don't apply to certain people. Still, nothing was confirmed, nothing was proven, and that uncertainty became the story. Because uncertainty keeps attention alive. People weren't asking, "Is this true?" anymore. They were asking, "Why does this feel familiar?" The conversation began shifting away from individuals and toward systems. Toward how fame insulates behavior, toward how NDAs can function as shields, toward how industries that move billions have a vested interest in stability, not truth. That framing changed everything. This wasn't about one person speaking out. It was about what happens when someone disrupts the rhythm. When silence is interrupted, not with facts, but with implication. Because implication forces response, even when no response is given. And then came the most unsettling development. Someone claiming proximity, not to the insider, but to the industry, hinted that the story had moved beyond social media, that discussions were happening quietly, not publicly, not performatively, in rooms without cameras, where reputations are weighed against risk. No confirmation followed, no denial came either, just quiet. And quiet, in moments like this, is rarely accidental. As days passed, attention should have shifted. Another scandal should have replaced it. But this one lingered. Because it wasn't flashy. It didn't offer closure. It didn't give audiences a villain or a hero. It offered discomfort. And discomfort is hard to dismiss. The woman at the center didn't return to explain. She didn't double down. She didn't walk anything back. She simply stopped engaging. And that absence forced people to sit with the implications on their own. What if this wasn't about exposure? What if it was about survival? What if speaking wasn't a choice, but a response to being quietly positioned as a problem in a much larger narrative? Those questions changed how the story was viewed, because suddenly the risk wasn't legal, it was social, and social consequences in Hollywood can be just as final. By the end of Part 1, nothing had been proven, no names confirmed, no facts established. But something had undeniably shifted. People were watching differently, listening more carefully, not for statements, but for movement, for who stayed close, for who pulled away, for who avoided the topic entirely. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't shout, it recalibrates, and whatever happens next won't arrive loudly. It never does. By the time the public realized this story wasn't fading, it had already changed shape. What began as online speculation had quietly evolved into something heavier, something harder to dismiss. Not because new evidence appeared, but because the behavior around the story became impossible to ignore. In Hollywood, reactions often reveal more than statements ever do. Behind the scenes, insiders described a noticeable tightening. Conversations that once flowed freely became cautious. Words were chosen carefully. Associations were reevaluated. It wasn't panic, but it was awareness. The kind that settles in when people realize a narrative might not be controllable this time. What made this moment different was the lack of counterattack. No coordinated pushback. No aggressive legal posturing. No forceful denials naming falsehoods line by line. Instead, the industry leaned into something far more effective: reframing. Entertainment commentary began softening the language. What was once discussed as implications became misunderstandings. Emotional reactions were highlighted. The conversation subtly shifted from systems to psychology, from culture to personal strain. That pivot wasn't accidental. When institutions feel threatened, they don't argue facts. They question stability. Because if the speaker can be framed as overwhelmed, confused, or misinterpreted, the message loses urgency. And urgency is dangerous. Still, the public wasn't fully convinced. Viewers noticed that while commentary changed, behavior didn't revert. Certain names stopped being mentioned together. Invitations quietly shifted. Public interactions became more distant, more formal. Nothing obvious enough to headline, but enough to suggest recalculation. And then there was the issue of timing. People began asking why these conversations surfaced now. Not years ago. Not at the height of fame. Why at this moment? According to online speculation, the answer wasn't exposure. It was pressure. Whispers suggested that private narratives had already begun circulating behind the scenes. That blame was being repositioned quietly. That certain individuals were being prepared as liabilities in a story the public hadn't yet seen. And speaking out wasn't the opening move. It was a response. That reframing changed how many people interpreted the silence. Because if someone speaks when they feel cornered, the goal isn't attention, it's protection. The woman who sparked the storm never claimed to be a hero. She didn't promise receipts. She didn't tease revelations. Instead, she spoke about patterns. About environments where accountability allegedly dissolved behind power. About how behavior becomes normalized when consequences are negotiable. Her tone, especially in later appearances, felt calculated, not dramatic. As if she understood that saying less carried more weight, and that restraint unsettled people far more than accusations ever could. At the same time, online audiences began noticing something else. How familiar this cycle felt. A voice speaks. Discomfort spreads. Silence follows. Narratives soften. Attention shifts. It wasn't new. It was recognizable. That recognition is what made this story linger. Because even without proof, the pattern felt real. And patterns don't need confirmation to be unsettling. They need context. Old blind items resurfaced again, not as proof, but as echoes. Past interviews were rewatched, not to accuse, but to understand tone. Fans weren't searching for guilt. They were searching for alignment. And alignment is dangerous to systems built on isolation. Meanwhile, the emotional toll became visible. Those close to the woman at the center described exhaustion, not fear-driven panic, but the fatigue that comes from realizing how heavy the cost of honesty can be. Isolation crept in. Communication narrowed. Trust became selective. Because once a line is crossed, there's no return to normal. What unsettled viewers most was her admission, not of wrongdoing, but of regret. Not regret for speaking, but regret for believing the system would respond with accountability instead of avoidance. She spoke about how truth is often welcomed publicly, but punished privately. That statement landed differently. It reframed the entire situation. This wasn't about destroying reputations. It was about refusing to carry a burden alone, about pushing back against quiet scapegoating, about challenging a culture that rewards silence and disciplines disruption. Still, nothing concrete emerged. No documents, no recordings, no direct allegations. And yet, the pressure didn't lift. Because behind closed doors, according to industry whispers, assessments were happening. Not investigations, evaluations, risk calculations. Who benefits if this fades? Who loses if it doesn't? What exposure looks like if conversations move beyond entertainment media? That's when the tone of the speculation changed again. People stopped asking if the story was true. They started asking what would happen if it wasn't contained. Because containment is the industry's specialty. What happens next is rarely explosive. It's procedural. Quiet reviews, private conversations, strategic distancing, damage control that looks like normalcy from the outside. And that's exactly what unfolded. Publicly, the industry returned to business. New releases, new headlines, new distractions. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. People were more careful. Associations felt more deliberate. Words were weighed before being spoken. Silence had changed behavior. The woman herself reappeared only briefly, not with explanations, not with accusations. Just a short, controlled message about truth, harm, and time. It felt less like communication and more like positioning, a signal rather than a plea. Those who understand how power works recognized it immediately. This wasn't escalation, it was patience. Because the loudest voice rarely wins in systems built on leverage. The one who waits does. Speculation exploded again. Was she stepping back? Was she being advised? Was she negotiating? Or was she simply protecting herself while attention cooled? No one knew, and that uncertainty became its own pressure point. Then came a quiet suggestion from someone anonymous, unaffiliated, and impossible to verify, that the story had moved into less visible spaces. Not podcasts, not social media, but internal processes, conversations that don't generate headlines unless something breaks. Again, no confirmation. Again, no denial, just possibility. And possibility is what unsettles power the most. Because if the claims were harmless, they would have been mocked. If they were false, they would have been crushed. Instead, they were absorbed, redirected, softened. That response spoke volumes. By the end of part 2, the story still had no conclusion. No villains, no heroes, no facts confirmed. But it had momentum, not viral momentum, structural momentum. The kind that doesn't trend, but changes behavior quietly. And that's when people realized something important. This was no longer about what had been said. It was about what might happen if the silence broke again. By the time most people realized how serious this had become, the story had already left the public stage. There were no more live streams, no emotional follow-ups, no dramatic revelations, just absence. And in an industry obsessed with visibility, disappearance is never neutral. When the woman at the center stopped posting altogether, speculation exploded. Some assumed she had been silenced. Others believed she was overwhelmed. But those who understood how power operates recognized something else entirely: transition. Because when stories stop unfolding online, they don't end. They relocate. Behind closed doors, sources described a different atmosphere. Not chaos, not outrage, calculation. Conversations shifted from reaction to risk, from image to exposure, from denial to preparation. And preparation doesn't make noise. What disturbed observers most wasn't what they heard, it was what they didn't. No lawsuits filed, no cease and desist letters made public, no definitive statements clearing names, just careful distance, measured language, and silence that felt rehearsed. In moments like this, innocence usually speaks loudly. Silence suggests leverage. Entertainment media followed suit. Coverage softened further. Stories were reframed as internet speculation. Headlines emphasized uncertainty. Mental strain became a talking point. The substance of the implications faded beneath concern for optics. That shift wasn't accidental, it was familiar. When systems feel exposed, they don't confront, they exhaust. But beneath that fade, behavior stayed altered. Industry insiders hinted that reviews were happening quietly. Not investigations in the public sense, but internal examinations. Assessments that don't generate headlines unless something forces them to. Again, no confirmation. Again, no denial. Just implication. The woman never returned to clarify. She never walked anything back. She never escalated. She simply stopped engaging. And that restraint may have been the most powerful statement of all. Because escalation invites attack. Silence invites scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't expire. What unsettled people most was how familiar the ending felt. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just unresolved. A story that didn't conclude, but paused. Because the most damaging truths rarely arrive as revelations. They arrive as discomfort, as questions that don't go away, as awareness that something isn't sitting right. Hollywood moved on publicly. New releases, new distractions, new headlines. But the unease remained, subtle, persistent. People watched more closely, spoke more carefully, trusted more selectively. Silence had changed behavior, and that may have been the point all along. This story didn't demand belief. It demanded attention, not to names, not to rumors, but to patterns. Because when fame protects behavior, silence becomes a weapon. And when silence becomes noticeable, systems reveal themselves. There was no final statement, no verdict, no clean ending. Just a question hanging in the air. Was the silence protection or preparation? Because pressure doesn't disappear when ignored. It builds. And eventually, pressure forces what's hidden to surface, whether through time, documentation, or consequences no one can control. This wasn't entertainment, it was a pressure point. And pressure points don't need volume to be dangerous. They just need time. If you've made it this far, understand something. This story wasn't meant to be comfortable. It wasn't designed to give you a clean ending or tell you what to think. It was meant to make you pay attention. Because the most powerful systems don't rely on lies. They rely on forgetting. They rely on distraction, on the next headline, on public amnesia. So don't let this be another moment that fades. Watch what happens next. Watch who stays silent,